in different countries. We've got London, London, Paris, New York, Montreal. We have academia. We have Capgemini Global, Fahrenheit. So it's a nice mix of people, quite broad. And my godchildren are right there in the background. I see them. And it's and I kind of wanted this to be much more about a little bit more socio-cultural of an insight masterclass than one that is so heavily based on what we have done for the past 17 years at Fahrenheit, which has been very much about innovation. The word experience is one of these words that you have to go through something in life, whether it's an event that you can actually you've been through an experience itself. And I would probably think that in this case, I would have loved at some point early on in my career if somebody had come to me and gave me a playbook on how to understand insights and how they can actually truly transform how you see the world and how they can impact every part of your life. Instead, I've gone through that experience, and I guess I'll share some of that with you today. Anyone that is certainly within the Fahrenheit realm is very familiar with insights. This will be a slightly different take on it. Everybody outside, this should help you in your day-to-day jobs, work, life, especially now more than ever. We live in a world where that's been turned upside down, and by so many forces, right? Our health and wellness is in jeopardy. Our environment is in jeopardy. Our nations are in jeopardy. Democracy as we know it is being challenged day to day to the core. And more than ever, we need to be able to decode and decipher the cues of our everyday lives. The world is gripped by misinformation. There is a lot of misinformation, and our authoritative figures are really not very present. And a lot of what we used to believe in is no longer there. So in a weird way, if I was giving the same speech, I would say 10 years ago, be very different, or 20 years ago, be very different, because the context we're in today is really quite acute. The world we live in today is a very different world. And that means that we have to be that much sharper as people and to be able to decipher the true meaning of what we're seeing versus what is on the surface. I will share this now. Where's this thing here? Let me just put this up, and voila. So, we hear about insights and more insights. And, I think exhaustion sets in when we hear this word used, certainly for all of us in the marketing communications world. But it's a word that's been misunderstood, misinterpreted, and I think when you really understand what it means and what it can actually do for you, it can be quite transformational way to start thinking and starting to process the world. So please just stop thinking of insights for today, that it's about your work or what you do day to day. This whole session was initiated by people within the network that wanted a masterclass in insights, and somehow it just grew bigger, forcing me to kind of make it broader and less about what we do than much more about our lives. So today is much more about focusing on you, right? So you are the focus of this, and it's about your ability to see the world differently. It's about your personal formation, your attention, your ability to be a richer, more dimensional individual. Ultimately, insights will offer you that. Insights can help you discern the truth from the false. Insights can actually help you realize the underlying meaning of any situation. And interestingly enough, two words that are often misused and misinterpreted. You can be very observant as an individual. That means you have the ability to walk into a room and suss out a situation and have a high level of observation. But it does not necessarily mean that you're insightful, okay? Insightful means that you see the world differently. Ultimately means that the world sees you differently, because when you are able to have a strong insight about a particular situation, it opens up the eyes of everybody around you. It gets them to see you very differently, because it says that you have something extra, something beyond what is actually on the surface itself. The image here is actually, it's a braille, but I love the term brailing a culture. And brailing a culture was a term created by Faith Popcorn in New York, like back in the late 90s. And it was a beautiful term that was all based on how an individual can actually braille a culture, which means sense a culture. It wasn't just what you're seeing, but it was all the underlying movement and all the underlying tension that exists in a culture. Therefore, when you braille a culture, you understand it. And that's what...
Come and see Mr. Rony a bit.
Okay. Now...
Ahmad?
Oh my God.
Not come.
And yet, there is no global word for insight, which means that many different cultures don't have a word for it. So having worked in France, I was quite surprised that there is no actual word for insight, and it's not used in the same way. In French, it's perspicacité, which is really not what we mean by it. At the same time, in Italian,
the whole school of
intuizione, which means that it's all based on intuition.
Yes,
and that's all about kind of the vision. In Galician, it's introspection. In German, it's Einblick. And in Arabic, it's tafsir, which means prediction. So what's interesting is that, and the origin of the word really comes from the Nordics, and it means inner sight. It means the ability to see, and it's an inner sight versus what's on the surface. I love this quote by Eleanor Roosevelt, and it is basically that great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, small minds discuss people. So the gateway to a great mind is always being able to discuss ideas, and I think that is such a meaningful thought construct, because the fuel for ideas are insights. Excuse me. There is no shortage of ideas in any home or office or company. There's actually tons of ideas all around us every day. In fact, day to day, everybody throws, all of us that know that work in innovation, they know that people just are constantly pitching you with ideas. And ultimately, an idea is only as good as the insight that makes it stick, because the insight is what actually is it's the glue, it's the connection point to, it's the raison d'etre, the meaning for an idea, why we actually need it in this world or not. A way to think of insights is that, for me, it's a second skin and second nature. The second skin means that insights are as important as your innate ability to know when the water's too hot. You know when water's too hot, when the stove's too hot, you're going to burn yourself. That's something that is actually very much second nature to us, that we all understand from growing up as a child. And I think insights can be that. And I think for some, they are naturally that, intuitively that. For others, it is a learned craft, and it can become that. Ultimately, what you're aiming for is having an insight shadow. And an insight shadow is when you feel that you've actually mastered the power of insight, when you're aware that at all times your insight shadow is processing the world around you and shining a spotlight on what matters, collecting the right cues and clues and sentiments in any situation. So I think for most of us, we develop this insight shadow, and it's this, it is a shadow that follows you around, that in essence is always looking for cues and clues, looking for the underlying meaning that is inherent. Insights are about clarity. Clarity is more than ever. The power of insight can help you see through an increasingly blurry world, giving you the power to see what you need to do for yourself or for your business, especially now in a post-COVID-19 world. But clarity is all about being able to decipher being able to decipher and pull out what really matters within any given situation. Truth. Insights are about the search for truth, about how things really are versus what they appear to be. In a world obsessed by appearances and misinformation, no matter what industry we're in, truth matters more than ever. And I think we feel that truth, we all feel that truth has been hijacked and denigrated, certainly in the past 5 years. And I think with the rise of social media, day by day, we question what is real and what is fake. And that has become a major part of our lives. And I think we need to figure out and understand how we can actually source it and find the truth. And the third thing that's critical is empathy. Empathy, this is about the trained eye, right? This is about it's turning what you see and how you feel, which in turn drives you to make connections that no one else is able to make. Empathy ultimately allows you to walk a mile in a man's shoe. Empathy allows you to feel the pain that somebody else is feeling, to feel the happiness. Empathy allows you to relate, all critical. So if you think about clarity, truth, and empathy, they become three core things that insights help, in essence, help you get to. And ultimately, it's all this is to develop a point of view, right? Because your point of view is what sets you apart. It's how you see the world and how it sees you as a free-thinking individual capable of discerning thought. Ultimately, your point of view says a lot about an individual. That says clearly this is somebody who understands the situation, the context, and what's important within that. What's interesting is I put this image here is that the point of view came from the Italian Renaissance by Brunelleschi. Before the Renaissance, mid 1500s, the world very much, art was all two-dimensional and very much driven by the church, and pretty much all very similarly it all looked the same. The perspective began to give a point of view to an artist that ensured that they could stand in a different place and have that perspective. So you can see how perspective and point of view, the origin of that certainly came out of art, and what that means for us today as individuals. Also very important is to have other points of view. So as an insightful person, you can have your own board. I mean, I have a set of people, friends, colleagues that I get my source of inspiration from, that I get incredible insights from, and on different issues, right? And because they have their own ways of uncovering the truth, they have their own ways of seeing the world, and their own ways of making connections. Actually, this morning, my Pilates instructor, Bea, she saw me struggling on the ground trying to do one of my movements, and I was looking at her on screen, and she was looking beautiful and elegant, long and lean, and I was sort of clunky and not doing it properly. And she said, "Don't worry, if it looks difficult, because it is difficult. Even for me, it's very difficult, but I have to make it look like it looks easy." And I just thought, wow, that's a great insight, because one assumes right away that a Pilates instructor walks around all day with everything in perfection, but she herself also has to she said, I have to be an actress all the time to make it look easy. That's a beautiful insight. So you can spend your day collecting insights from different people in different places and different sources, right? I mean, whether that's in media, in books, or wherever else. Listening versus hearing. Admittedly, I'm not the best listener. Some of my colleagues on here would attest to that. In fact, I have attended 2 weekend workshops on listening. The first time was good, but I had to go back because I didn't hear it well enough. But when I hear a great insight and a point of view, I'm the first to sit up and notice, because nothing gets my attention than when somebody makes connections that I can't make or haven't made, or combinations which I have not made. And to me, that's quite meaningful. It gets you to listening is one thing, but actually hearing what somebody's saying, I think is accelerated when you have a way to see the world that, my case or any other case, that they haven't been able to connect it that same way. I do want to talk about somebody very important. I asked her to join us today. Dr. Barbara Nuremberg, PhD. A lot of us know her and love her dearly. Barbara is a psychiatrist, a Freudian, and trained in research. And in the Belle Epoque of Fahrenheit, probably in the early years when we're all in New York, young, full head of hair, having great parties. Barbara was the sage amongst us, and Barbara was truly remarkable in how she could get insights. And while most researchers will conduct research and try to scratch the surface, Barbara, being a psychiatrist, had her own set of tools. And quite frankly, I'm indebted to her because she certainly opened up my eyes and my senses in a whole new way. And I think for most of us that were with her, that worked with her, recognize the brilliance of Barbara. And I haven't worked with her in a long time, but I can tell you that I haven't had an insight as good as Barbara certainly could glean and to come up with. And it's a testament to the fact that different people, different skill sets and different approaches can actually get really good insights that are quite meaningful for all of us. So, okay, so what is an actual insight is the question. There's been many definitions of an insight, and at Fahrenheit we've written papers about this. And what we found was that there is no industry definition that justly pays tribute. So this insight, I think, is more from a socio-cultural perspective. And I've defined it as the underlying human truth that has the power to transform how you see and feel the inherent tension in any situation. So underlying human truth is very important, which means that your job is to dig and to scrape the surface and really get to the truth, the humanity behind the truth behind the humanity. And that truth has the power to transform how you see and feel. It's obvious that inside that there's a level of sight behind that. It is about seeing, but feeling is often forgotten. And I think it's because feeling and feelings are not a science and are difficult to capture and difficult to express. They're often forgotten. But I think a good, insightful person is somebody who has the power to see and feel and make the connection between those two. And ultimately, what they're seeing and feeling is this tension in any situation, right? And what you're seeing is what's right or what's wrong in any situation. So ultimately, it gives you the ability to sense below, to go one or two layers below what is on the surface. When you're forming an insight, the reality is that the context we're in today is changing at such a rate and such a pace that it makes it much more of a challenge, because an insight that you come up with 2 months ago versus now versus in the future can be quite different based on the same subject matter. So, but the context is your starting point, and understanding the situation is critical. Typically, when you're trying to think about the actual context, you're really trying to figure out how to take this world that's pretty big and large and try to chunk it down into manageable, into a place, into a little bubble that you can begin to decipher and understand. The more you can take a big world and chunk it down and make it more meaningful, the sharper your insight. If you have an insight that's very much at a macro level, what happens is that it becomes so generic that it's really not a good insight. It just becomes it's a little bit too obvious to be a good insight. So, and in a world turned upside down, empowered by mass media, and I think what's critical is that we have to be sharper than ever, and to ensure our mental survival and our ability to make the right choices and decisions by understanding these codes. So that means that in any context that we're looking at today, we have to make sure that we know what to look for, decipher, and what to group and what to set aside, so you can begin to understand. That situation. Ultimately, you can. I think there is for me certainly, I find that when you're forming an insight, negativity can be your friend here, because the power of insight can take the negative energy in the world around you in your life or in business and transform it into a positive solution. Ultimately, we find ourselves looking for what's wrong and trying to right it. I mean, it's the nature of human beings. And negative energy is fuel for insights, right? You need to use your negative tools to assess the world around you and identify all the problems, because that is ultimately what we find ourselves doing, is trying to find the negative pain points, trying to figure out how to actually make those positive. At the same time, we can use positivity, right? I get asked a lot about this, whether do I have to be negative to develop an insight? It's like, well, no, but can somebody who's very positive come up with a good insight? Of course they can, because positivity is ultimately the state we're aiming for, right? The challenge is that if somebody's super positive, just has to think it's a lot tougher for them to see the negativity or what's wrong, and therefore they have to dig deeper to kind of find the challenge there. And I would love to hear from Barbara towards the end, Barbara, your thought on this particular point here. So ultimately, we have pleasure and pain tools, right? And these tools they really help us get to what we're trying to get at, and they become very intuitive for us as people. So I think in a time like this, as we're going through right now, certainly given the current climate we're in, the tools, the pain point tools, are actually quite meaningful in the sense that you are able to very quickly get to what the challenge is. But being skeptical, being critical, being judgmental, being provocative is your toolkit, right? It's the naysayer. Being a naysayer can be your best friend when trying to form an insight, because it helps you to filter and assess the world. They also ensure that you don't accept the status quo, right? The reality is, and no one can put up blinders around you. When you're somebody who's very skeptical, you have the ability to see things for what they really are, and that's what these tools will do for you. Being positive, good-natured, playful, happy can equally be important, right, in helping you form an insight. But because we're programmed to right what is wrong and to improve the world we live in, positive insights rarely appear. And it's interesting, but I'm trying to think about how many positive insights we've actually had to, or have come up with, so socially, personally, or even in a professional setting. Quite rare, because generally that's not insights. It's not really what we're out to do. We're out generally to find what's wrong and trying to fix it as people. And then, expressing an insight can be daunting. And this is something that a lot of people verbally can express. Some cannot. I've met people that are very, very insightful, but don't have the ability to express it. And yet that there's a lot going on there, and you can pull out the great thinking behind all of that. And that's it's important for us to kind of know that, because again, in any social setting or in any corporate setting, there are people that are more experienced or less experienced with connecting, how they see and what they feel. And it's incumbent upon us to kind of see how we can help them with that. And then if we think about when we're trying to uncover human truth, generally, it's like one of these tests that we try to deploy, is that how do you know if you have a really good insight? Ultimately, we say, let's just kind of ladder it. Ladder means you put it on a ladder, keep pushing it up, up and up. And that means you keep asking the question, so therefore, what does that mean? Until you get to a point where you feel like you really scratched the surface. You really got to the human truth. And what I'm going to do is share with you a few examples of insights that are sort of contextually relevant today, but you'll see very quickly the difference between an observation and an insight. Well, this very current today, obviously, time does not heal all wounds, right? We assume that as we grow up, things naturally and positively change for the better, because history has taught us that. However, we forget that there are negative forces working against us at all times. And unless we actively drive change, the momentum of time is not necessarily on our side. So it's not an observation, it's an insight. Because the observation with George Floyd and what's happening currently it's obvious, right? I mean, the racism is obvious, the injustice is obvious. But when you start really thinking and dig deep and try to uncover the human truth, it's that, you know, time does not heal all wounds. And I think this current situation proves that. And we all grow up and think that, you know, that as we grow up, things get better with time, because when we study history, of course, we're looking at history in, you know, in decades and centuries, and things got better in those periods of time. But that doesn't hold necessarily true, especially when there's negative forces working against them. So ultimately, it means that you have to be very conscious of that, and you have to actively drive the change, the momentum. Again, an insight is not intended. It's not a science. It's not intended to be 100% right or 100% wrong. It is an insight, and it's your point of view. Every person on this call today can have a different insight on the current situation, and ultimately, ultimately, that's the whole point here. Is that, but what it does is it actually sparks a conversation. It sparks a conversation that says, yeah, you know what, gosh, you know what, time does not heal all wounds, and you know what, I kind of thought, you know, through time things will get better, but clearly I have to be much more active. I mean, it drives a conversation. At the same time, this is quite provocative, right? You know, everybody's, you know, proclaiming looting as, of course, thugs and thieves, and yes, some are for sure. But I mean, when you look at the deep human truth behind this, right? I kind of saw this as that, given the decades of unjust treatment and deep-rooted racism and oppression, many people of color have felt held back, making the proverbial American dream. Looting for some is a proxy for the need to be compensated for the years of hardship they're owed. So ultimately, this is payback, right? If I'm looting, for some people, if I'm looting, it's because it's a hardship compensation. I'm not condoning any looting by any means, but I think you could look at a percentage of these people, and most likely they feel that they're actually being compensated for the many years of hardships that they've actually endured. To change the subject, the Disney bubble. I always love to pick at Disney. Originated as the ultimate form of family entertainment. So we know Disney, amazing, right? So they're amazing on so many fronts. Then they created something called Disney Town in Celebration, Florida. And this was the ultimate form of escapism. A way for families to exit the harsh realities of the world and into a sanitized version. One which harkens back to the idyllic post-war America of the 50s. So what they did was they came and created this kind of very Truman Show, idyllic town that's very, very planned in every way, where everything is hidden, the garbage is hidden. So I mean, it's very much like a Disneyland, but people live there. So this antebellum home, which exists usually in the South, is actually now in Florida. And what's the insight here is that in creating for Disney, in creating this town, they in essence created an era which excluded visible and invisible minorities. So a massive oversight. So if you were to look at, if you were to come in and look at Disney and say, I love them for this, but then when you look at them for this particular thing, you're like, you know what? That's a massive miss. How you could actually, and it's been referred to as a creepy planned town, because it completely overlooked the fact that 50s America excluded visible and invisible minorities. This one came from a friend of mine, which I love very much. And when ISIS became a global terrorism threat, certain media proclaimed Islam as radical Islam. That's how they're being referred to, as radical Islam, condemning an entire religion, when in fact, ISIS became the cause célèbre of radicals. So any radical anywhere was raising the ISIS flag. Thus, it was really much more about the Islamization of radicals. When he said this to me, it completely turned my world around. And it completely gave me a flip to understand what was happening that I had not seen. And that's what a good insight does, right? It's kind of when everybody's proclaiming them as, all radicals, as radical Islam. And the fact that this was actually the Islamization of radicals was a very, very powerful insight that got you to understand what was really happening under the radar. This actually is a friend and a brilliant designer, and I love this insight of hers because she's a pretty powerful and quite well known furniture designer and home furnishings designer. And when she recently created a line here, which is basically wood marquetry with all of these different, birds in nature that are actually carved into the actual pieces of wood. And the insight here is that more and more we isolate ourselves from nature to live in the urban environment. And furthermore, mass standardization in home furnishings further strips nature out of the natural. So for her, this was how she could bring back nature into our everyday lives. But this is a really good design insight. This is an insight from somebody who has her pulse on the world around her, and is lucky enough to have her own company and very quickly react. When you compare to other big design furniture companies, the big Italian ones, the gap between the person that has that insight and the reality of manufacturing is so broad that it takes a long time for them to react, and therefore Nada herself is quite powerful doing this. I think that this is one around, when you think about Venice and you think about the fact that it took a global health pandemic that locked us up for 10 weeks to realize the degree to which we have physically been a massive strain on cities like Venice and its natural resources. It's quite remarkable when you started seeing all these videos appearing of the clear canals of Venice. And furthermore, I love this quote by Oscar Wilde, which is, "All men kill the things they love." And the insight for me is that not all humans need to touch, feel, and smell a place. So why are they all traveling the same way and being treated as the same kind of traveler? So I look at that and I say, and we've all been evidence to a lot of tourists that show up, and that especially in Venice, when they come in on the large cruise ships, 8,000, they come out for the day, they bring their own lunches with them, and their iPhones and cameras, and all they do is they actually film and then they go away. That kind of a traveler is not the same traveler that one who's looking to immerse themselves in the city itself and its people and its culture. And so why should they all be treated the same? So if I was to talk to the city of Venice and say, great, out of the COVID-19 crisis, how do you manage people and traffic flow? This would be an insight that you talk to them about. So you know what? Not everybody's the same way. There's other ways, right? There's other ways that, the role of technology and virtual reality can be a brilliant way to get some of these people to actually get this experience without having to be there at a much cheaper cost. So again, you see how you look at the underlying the human truth behind different situations. Another one, this one actually is all around, so it's all around utilities, right? And around our environment, right? If the supply and demand economic model traditionally set the price of a commodity, and that led us towards an unsustainable future, then the real price is the cost to replace that natural resource versus deplete it. So we've always been operating under the fact that it's supply and demand and set a price for that, when the reality is, there is a limited supply and we're seeing the end of that. Therefore, why aren't we paying for the price to replace a natural resource versus actually the depletion of it? Again, that is the kind of an insight that if you're talking to a utilities company, that you could actually discuss and it could have quite meaningful impact with them. Last but not least, the unintended consequences of AI. We hear a lot of people talking about AI, and so as the world becomes increasingly polarized on all topics, from politics to environment with little alignment, how can we agree on a code of ethics and morality as it pertains to the unintended consequences of AI? And so when fatalities occur, who's to blame? The number one question today is, when an accident happens and somebody's hurt or dies in an autonomous vehicle, who's responsible? And there's a lot of thinking going on, but there's no code of ethics around and morality on artificial intelligence. So that question's ultimately, how do you get aligned on that? And if you're aligned in the US, will other countries be aligned as well? And what would that look like? How long will that take? And the pace of technology is much faster than the pace of that governments can move at. So, and we've seen that already. And that right there is quite a misalignment. So you can see. Oh, hold on for a second. So I hope that gave you a bit of an idea as to how to think of insights and how they should help you think about the world that we're in today. Barbara, are you on the call by any chance? You'd have to unmute yourself. No, I don't think she is. Okay, hold on for a second. I'm trying to figure out how to get back into the actual screen where I see everyone. Stop sharing. There we go. There we go. Mark Payne is on. Hello, hello, hello. So guys, you'd have to unmute yourselves to, if anyone wants to speak, please unmute yourselves. I see a lot of names in here, but just please go ahead. Barbara, are you not on? I guess she's not.
Hey, Rony.
Hey, Mark. How are you?
Hey, Rony. How are you, man?
Good, good, good.
Hey, I love pushing insight out of our day to day into our lives. I think it's really powerful, and these insights about world events. I think are something we don't spend a lot of time talking about, and it's been on all of our minds. And I think it's refreshing to pull back and think about insight in that broader way, as well as as a way to not just navigate projects, but to navigate life. So I think that's pretty inspiring and profound, and served up as only Rony can, with Jesus and and Renaissance art and all the glory that comes with it. But this was really cool. Quite a perfect accompaniment to the first cup of coffee over here.
Rony,
Yes.
I have a question, because I attended other trainings of yours, and everything you're explaining is clear and very helpful. But I remember a training when you gave a sort of equation. Think about this plus think about this equal an insight. And I believe for some people who are not experienced consultants, or maybe some peoples in the crowd that are not Fahrenheit, that could actually be helpful for them to train themselves a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's I think it's just that the audience is so much broader today that
Yeah.
that's a little bit, I can certainly send it out to the team. It is, I mean, ultimately you kind of want a quick, I mean, to be honest with you, when I do this for students and universities, to me, it's like you just become Fahrenheit. The brilliance of Fahrenheit is that it trains you to think very quickly on your feet. And in any situation, it's like context, pain point, insight, and then boom, idea. And you become so good at that. And you sort of, it becomes, you can very quickly suss out the situation you're in, find the problem that you're seeing in there. What are you seeing and how are you feeling about that? And then you get heard very quickly. And I think that's ultimately what this is, right? It's about being able to understand and process the world around you in a very rapid way. Because I don't think we are. I just think that we need these tools today. I find myself every morning as I'm watching the news, I am just astounded at the amount of change, flux, challenges, and problems. And on top of it, having to validate who is actually where the content's coming from, and which is a whole new job to do. It's like if you're on YouTube, well, and at the same time, if you go to the known networks, the known networks have a very, very singular almost perspective. So you're caught between the world of a singular perspective of all these networks that feed you content the way they want to feed you content, and then you having to actually search and find the right content, and then credential and be sure that actually it's not some weird sort of neo-Nazi group somewhere. And this is the problem with that, right? Is that we're left having to be that much smarter about the world around us.
Hey, Rony, this is Todd. Can you hear me?
Todd Rovac,
Hello.
where are you? See you.
I'm in Brooklyn. No reason not to be in Brooklyn. It's great. Everybody should come. Um, I really enjoyed it as well. Would you talk a little bit more for those that are kind of new to this around the negativity piece? Because you went through it kind of quickly.
Sure.
There's a lot of challenging and a lot of I think it's a great point because the idea of being a challenger and looking for new angles and is important. But look, tough to be negative on ISIS, but like show us how you did it. Like if you could give us a sense of like what you mean by negativity for that, because it went kind of quickly.
Yeah, sure. I mean, listen, ultimately, I think if our job in everyday life is, listen, none of us are out to create a bad world. Not really, not this. Not in this context, right? We're all out to create a better world. So intuitively, we're all out to right what is wrong. And to right what is wrong means you have to be able to decipher and intuitively know what is right or wrong. And one of my favorite words is that you learn as a Canadian is the word fair. And there probably is no better word for Canadian than the word fair, because fair and fairness is ultimately makes you have to decide and use your judgment, your ethics, your moral code as to what is this fair or not. It doesn't pass judgment. It puts you in a place to have to do that. And when you deploy negative tools, it allows you to come in and to test any situation. So undoubtedly ISIS, yes, is a terrorist organization. And when you start looking at it, but when you dig deeper and deeper, and you begin to understand at the time what was happening, which was there was all these terrorist activities popping up all over the place. And ISIS would say, yeah, that's us. And the guy would say, oh yeah, I guess it is ISIS. And why? Because it was a cause célèbre. And to do that, you need to be able to understand the situation, the context, and really understand the people, the disenfranchised terrorists, why they were behaving that way. And ultimately, when they're disenfranchised, and this is quite a common thing, we see a lot of them, when they are disenfranchised, ultimately there's usually a lack of belonging, right? They don't belong to any one entity, any one place, and I think ultimately this is very much about, I belong to this group, which is one way or another, behind me, so I think that's what happened there.
Cool, thank you.
Rony, hello from Lebanon.
Hello, Rania.
Hey, I had read once an article that, and actually I tried to look for it before your class. I couldn't find it. It said that reading insight is actually reading between the lines, and it's not really what's written on the page, but it's what's not written on the page.
Yeah.
But what had bothered me in that article is that before reading that, it says it's for smart people who actually are reading between the line. And it bothered me because a lot of smart people don't really have insight.
Yeah, it's true.
And you touch on that is, do you have insight? Can you learn how to
sure.
develop it?
Listen, there are people of very high order intelligence, high order academic intelligence that are not insightful. And that's totally fine. And at the same time, there are people that are very insightful that don't necessarily have to have an education or any high order education. It's ultimately not about, so they're quite different for me, because some of the most insightful people are some of the simplest people you'll meet in your life. Like when you're traveling somewhere in Italy or some village somewhere, and you get a gem of wisdom from somebody that just changes your whole world. That is somebody that actually has ability to see, what underneath the covers, right? Underneath, and I think so. To me, it's kind of, they're mutually exclusive. But ultimately, I think it is a learned skill. I think it can be learned skill. In my years of experience, I've somehow found that the UK, the Brits are very, very good at insight. And it's just, I feel it's a very intuitive thing for the Brits. And I'm not sure I've seen that everywhere else, you know, and I don't know why. And it's just, when I compare it to the US, having been in the US, it feels like it's a very learned craft, and yes, it can be learned. And I think ultimately it's because from a cultural perspective, and I think, and Canadians too are quite good at it. I think ultimately it's when you are an American and the world revolves, that's how you see that you are in the center of the world and the world revolves around you. It's very hard to have insight in a social cultural perspective. I just think it's very, very tough to do that. When you're sitting outside the globe and you don't have your place and you are not the center of the universe, you are I think you develop a sense of insight to understand your place in the world. And I think ultimately that's always been my way to understand the difference and why I see such dramatic differences between the two. Having said that, in our French office, we have very insightful people. Although the French don't have a word for insight, they're certainly have a very powerful way to see the world that actually is quite meaningful. So there's such different flavors of it, and that's what kind of makes it interesting, is the different flavors of insight. But yeah, I mean, you're right. It is reading between the line, and anyone can read between the line. Ultimately, it's what tools you have to uncover what's between the line. Somebody put their hand up called Shepherd Baron.
Oh yeah, that was me.
Shepherd Baron.
Hey, it's my last name.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hello, Rory.
That's
Rory,
all right. Don't worry. I had just a question. I'm just trying to work it out in my own head for the people that, again, haven't been through the training and aren't as experienced. So from an event side, how would you describe the difference between a hypothesis and an insight? And I can give an example if you want, but I thought I'd leave it there first.
Well, I mean, a good hypothesis is based off an insight, right? So you first have to have a way to see, you have to start with an insight into a particular challenge, and then a hypothesis can come in and say, if you believe, if you really truly believe that the solution to Venice is to create a whole new way to divide up the different tourists in different buckets, where some go physically, others go virtually, then that could actually transform the future of Venice. That could transform the existence of Venice. I mean, that to me is a hypothesis, right? It comes in and it's based on how you see and what you see as the challenge in Venice is. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I guess. I was just trying to get it straight in my head. I think maybe it's because I'm a consultant, I guess, and I'm coming at this from a structured consulting page.
Ultimately, you're hypothesizing, right? When your hypothesis is you're hypothesizing on their scenarios, right? They're what ifs. They're like, what if we did this? What if we did that? And you can have a different hypothesis for a different insight, but in general, you can have 5 hypotheses based on the same insight on Venice, right? But ultimately, it's an insight is your anchor, right? It's like it's how you're seeing the real human truth, right? The underlying human truth, and based on that underlying human truth, then it's actually you're going to hypothesize 2 or 3 different ways as to how you may solve that problem. Cyril. Hands up by Cyril.
Yeah, hello everyone. Hi Ronnie, thanks for the amazing presentation. I was just wondering if perhaps insights were more common in those cultures that used more innuendo-driven communication. For instance, we know that the British the communication for the British is slightly different than the Americans. The Americans are usually more direct and more forward. While for instance, the British and the Japanese could use a lot of wording to express something and not necessarily directly allude to the the topic, and maybe that could be an explanation as to why some cultures are much stronger and better at understanding insight than others. Just wondering.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's an interesting hypothesis. That's a hypothesis. It's interesting because I think what you're getting at is an Irishman, an Englishman, a Frenchman, and an American, a Canadian, a Brit, would all have very different insights, and the expression of that insight, I think, based on their own cultural, on the formation that the world they come from, and I think also the ability. So when I say use negative tools, I think probably an Irish person who is a naturally storyteller and can see a situation in a, very, very broadly, and in a way are self-deprecating, can probably have a very different insight than a Brit or somebody else. So to me, it's almost like, I think there's something there for sure, that the culture that you come from is actually can make a big difference.
Thank you.
Anyone else have a question?
So Rony, I've got one for you. Comedians are some of the most insightful people on the planet. Things are funny 90% of the time because they're true and you don't think about it. Any thoughts around that? Like, how do they get to these crazy observations of all these things that are hidden in plain sight and yet are, so potent somehow?
Yeah, that's so. I mean, listen, Jerry Seinfeld's genius was his power of insight, right? I mean, it was his ability to take everyday, very basic situations and have an insight that has been under our nose for all these years, but we've never been able to see it that way. And that's the brilliance of Seinfeld. I mean, ultimately, listen, Todd is a very funny man. Todd, our CEO, is a very funny man, and he used to be a comedy writer, and he's very insightful. He has a way to see certain situations different than others, and I think comedy is. If somebody is trained in comedy, I think that they're probably the sharpest of anyone in insight, in terms of. And listen, look at all the late night shows, right? Look at all the late night shows, right? Generally, probably the funniest ones and the sharpest ones, the most politically astute ones, are the ones that are actually very insightful, right? Compare James Corden, he's funny, but he's not necessarily insightful. And so when you start looking at him that way, it's like you begin to realize that those that have the ability to see the current world we're living in with a very different kind of processing power and negative skeptical skills are naturally going to be funnier and sharper with their insights as comedians. Yeah, that's so true. That is so true.
Thank you, sir.
Anyone else?
Hi, Rony. It's Pete Malik, long-time listener, first-time caller.
Oh, no. You're funny too, Pete. You're very funny too.
In your career at Fahrenheit, you must have seen quite a few insights. Can you give us your top three?
I think you broke him, Pete.
Yeah, he got so excited.
Yeah.
Well, that's depressing.
Oh, he's back.
Pete, you crashed me.
Pete, repeat your question.
Sorry, Rony. It's Pete Malik. I imagine you've seen quite a few insights in your 15 years across the global network that is Fahrenheit. Could you just give us your top three, please? The ones that either you created or someone else created that you believe are the best.
I think we have the wrong audience for that because I think they're such a professional setting. We have a lot of non-Fahrenheiters in here, and we also have some outside people from the company as well. But that's a good question. I'm sorry, Pete, but we have others that are on here as well.
So, Rony, I love the fact that you rightly acknowledge that the Brits are the most insightful of all the nations. But I mean, you've lived in so many different places, and had that visibility on kind of how people do this in different countries in different places. But I was also just thinking about how you've used those different experiences to harness and improve your insight. Is there a sort of a way of realizing, if you're putting yourself in all of these different places, that it sharpens and just how would you describe that, in yourself or potentially for us all?
I mean, I think I feel it's almost like in the UK, I find that generally speaking, there's such a broad I mean, first of all, I think the culture you're in matters enormously in terms of understand the context that you're in matters a lot because it's a purview, right? It's like where you are matters and how you're expressing an insight. You and I, you being in New York and me being here can both have insights on what's happening today in the US. And me being, if I'm doing it from a UK perspective, they're just gonna be so dramatically different because there's a purview, first of all, where you're from, and probably also a level of, I think, judgment as well. So I think when you look at most Brits, most French people, most Europeans, as they look upon the US, their insights into the US is quite judgmental, and often don't go deep enough to understand the why, right? So to me, when I'll be somewhere and they'll say, oh, Americans are, they're like crazy or doing this or doing that, and it's kind of like, because at the surface that's what's happening, right? If you were to look at the media at the surface, you can very quickly glance at media and say, there's chaos in the US today, right? And but when you start to really look at that and dig deeper, you begin to look for what's happening underneath. I think that's not easy for most people to do. So in a way, you being in the US would give us a much more deeper meaning and understanding of what's happening from your insightful perspective than probably we would in the UK, because ours is going to be looking upon you, I think, in a very, and I think, like I said, you're using your tools of negativity, judgment, skepticism, you're being negative to be able to get to it. But I don't think, I don't know if it would be any better than what you would come up with, is my point. So I do think where you're at, equally a French person that doesn't understand the true American, what it means to be an American, and the right to bear arms, and the fact that as you were rebels, Americans were rebels, and that's how they created the colony, was a colony of rebels, and that's how they, they were young, and only 250 years old or whatever. So it's a very young country. If you don't really understand that, you can very quickly mistake the U.S. Because it's a commercial, it's a financial powerhouse. You can very quickly mistake them for having had all the depth and all the hundreds hundreds of years to mature when they really haven't. So in essence, like my mother says, the U.S. is a teenager. She calls them they're a teenager, and they kind of are when you compare them to Europe, right? So very, very different. Any other questions? Our time
Hi,
is.
Rony.
Andreas, how are you?
Good. Hi, guys.
Our French queen in Paris.
I have a question related to language. Sometimes, very much that because of my Greek upbringing and Greek origins, I stick very much to language, to play around with words, because this is how Greek language is created.
Yeah.
So how can we use language in different kind of definitions from different parts of the world? And you remember every time when we were working together, we always would spend some time going in different language, in Arabic, in Greek, in Chinese, to see the definitions, because actually it's going to bring out some thinking. So that's my first question, if you want to comment on that. And the second one is about, like, it's kind of personal, is like, when are you going to write a book?
Oh God, no.
Yeah. You have to do that.
First question. I mean, listen, I firmly believe a language is a set of, codes, cues, feelings, emotions, inside. I mean, the reality is the more languages you speak, the richer you are. And, you speak 3 languages. I speak 3, and I'm learning Italian. And with every language, you get a very different set of associations. When you and I work together, I particularly loved that word. That was an eye opener for me. The word was an insight. That word what was the word for traveler? What was that word?
It was, it's about hospitality. In Greek, we use the word philoxenia, which means philo means I love, and xenia comes from the word xenos, which means stranger. So which means it's an approach toward hospitality, saying that I love the stranger.
Right, which is, we don't have a word for that in any other language. We really don't. If anything, I mean, we have words for fear of strangers, but you actually have a word for. So to me, that right away, that's an insight into your culture. That's an insight into your culture that says, the Greek culture is a very welcoming culture, which would be an enormous word to use, and probably an insight if you were thinking of working with, Greek tourism. I mean, it's like all of a sudden now it's like, wow, you have words that we don't have. And that to me is, although, Greek is it's root to so many languages, but the reality is that word is a massive eye opener, right? And it's a beautiful word. So, I mean, to me, there's so many, every language has words. And as a Lebanese person, when I'm speaking with somebody who's Lebanese, like Irania or somebody else, you're speaking in 3 languages because you can't express yourself enough with one language. And I think ultimately, of course, that makes you a richer, a more insightful person. It has to, because you're drawing upon different languages, right? I mean, for sure it is, right? I think it's and I think in Paris, listen, the Paris office, the power of the Paris office is that they're bilingual, is the fact that they're able to, work and present in French and in English. Not that Germany isn't and Sweden isn't. I see the Germans and the Swedes there. But Paris is very actively working in those languages, and I think Germany does as well. Sweden pretty much works in English now. But the reality is, and you think about our work in innovation, it needs the English language, right? The French language doesn't have enough words to express, certainly a lot of the insights that we want to get to, and even the ideas.
Hey, Rony, it's Adam here. I've got a question for you.
Adam Rubin, lovely to hear from you.
So my question is related to places to be inspired by when it comes to insight, reading insightful people, watching insightful film, listening to insightful music or lyrics in music. And I was just curious if you can share with us some of your playlist, whether that's what's on your shelf or what's on your screen, but would love to know, some artists who you feel are, visual artists too, right? Like anyone who you feel we might be inspired by when it comes to insightful content, provocative thoughts.
Sure. I mean, listen.
Thanks for doing this session, by the way.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I mean, listen, there is currently no richer mind and no one more brilliant than Yuval Harari. And you all know how much I think the world of him. And Yuval Harari, who wrote Homo Sapiens, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, his genius is his ability to make connections that we only see when he makes them. And reading Yuval Harari is constantly, you're flogging yourself. I'm constantly hitting myself why I didn't see what he saw. And to the point where you can get a complex from this guy. But he's remarkable. And I mean, and he sees the world in a very unique way. Clearly, he's a global, global bestseller and a brilliant mind. But the reality is, he makes connections across different fields that up until now they haven't made. No one else had actually made those same connections. And I think that's certainly he is top of my list. I think the philosopher Alain de Botton, who is incredible. He is also, he sees the world very differently. Typically, philosophers, this is what I find interesting, is that a lot of the social sciences and social and literature. I mean, look at even incredible writers like French writers like Clément Guéry. I was reading on the weekend. You will get incredible insights from incredible writers. You'll get incredible insights from, it's people that are actually out to decipher the world differently than you are. And I think it's really hard to get great insights from very mainstream sources. You simply don't. Fareed Zakaria on CNN, I think is phenomenal. He gets you to see the world differently. For a mainstream anchor, he's quite remarkable. But generally, I find that the more you dig into philosophy and into history, and bizarrely, I find myself very attracted to philosophy, right, and philosophers, and feeling very gapped also in and wanting to sort of get a lot richer in that, just in philosophy, simply because they had a way to see the world and have a way to see the world that is so not where we're at today. And in fact, Yuval Harari said, in the future with AI replacing a lot of low skilled labor, the safest job you can have is, according to him, which is remarkable. And at Fahrenheit, we've hired a lot of philosophers in the past. We've had a lot of people come in with philosophy degrees that have been quite remarkable, and it's simply because they know how to think, right? And they know how to find, look between the lines and look for the gray area. So to me, it's kind of like, it really is more the, to be honest with you, I don't personally get I don't get nurtured a lot by, like, a Wired magazine is a Wired magazine, and it's a trade magazine. I don't necessarily get that kind of inspiration from it, insight from it. It's not where I kind of get but that's me, but others can, right? It all depends on but generally, your best bet is to look at people that are actually doing the thinking and learn from them. So when I talk about having your board of influence, of insightful people, it's these kinds of people that are, that to me are the richest, right?
Thanks, Rony.
Pleasure. Okay, I think any more questions? Because I think we've gone over time here. Anything else?
There's a question in the chat, Rony, from Isabel. Oh. Can you read it, or do you want to read it?
Oh, sure. Let me see. Chat, Isabel. Oh, here she is. She says, I can't seem to raise my hand or unmute myself, but wondering what the difference between perspective and insight is, as you've described it. Many of the examples mentioned have highlighted a difference in perspective and a difference in observation. As such, do you see this as inextricably linked to diversity? Okay. Well, I mean, listen, at the end of the day, perspective and point of view to me are very, very similar. They have the same general meaning. But I don't think you can have a good perspective or point of view without first having an insight. A point of view, it needs you to actually see the world differently. And you're not going to see the world differently unless you have insight. So it's very much reliant upon it, right? It's kind of and I think, or you can have a weak point of view and a weak perspective, or a generic one, and that's fine. But if you want to have a unique point of view and unique perspective, I think it desperately needs you to really have a good insight, and because ultimately an insight is about you seeing the world differently. And then you see here, do you see this inextricably linked to diversity? Example, difference in perspective and difference in observation due to diversity. I'm not sure I understand the question. Do you see this as an linked to diversity? Isabel, can you unmute yourself? There's an unmute button. It's the little speaker button. Just click on it.
Can the call admin unmute Isabel maybe?
I'm trying.
Sorry, Bernie. Well, I don't know if it was. I wanted to ask Bernie, so I wouldn't have said call.
I mean, I guess Isabel, the insights I had in here were very much, I mean, underlying all of that is an understanding of diversity and what diversity is and what it means. And ultimately, ultimately, I think, of course, they're linked, because if you're making an insight on George Floyd, and you're, in essence, if the insight which I talked about very much was based on the fact that we spend our lives thinking that just because we're growing up, that change is naturally happening, and you wake up one day and you realize, no, it hasn't. It's actually gone backwards. Of course, I mean, racism, diversity, all of these very much are in the same well, right? And I mean, they are inextricably linked, because they have to be, right? I mean, ultimately, it's about your openness and your ability to seek out the real human truth.
Sorry, I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Oh, there we go.
This is Isabel. Yeah, no, I just wanted to clarify. What I meant was just that in terms of the link with diversity was just that in sort of saying you have to come at insight, you have to look at something differently in order for it to be considered insight. What are you considering different? Because I guess, is it different to the status quo, in which case I think it is linked to diversity, in that if you've got a very samey or homogenous group of people, insight comes from somebody that's different or that looks at something differently. But that's not necessarily, I'm trying to understand how it's
Sure,
I'm trying to understand how it's something you can teach yourself or you can learn. If my understanding of it seems to be more about how you approach something, and that's quite linked to your experiences and how you approach something. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's a good question, because I think inherently a group of people coming from the same background, same education, same, very much formed together, I think it's a lot more challenging for there to be a breakout insight that sees the world differently. And I think it's a lot harder to do that. I think naturally when you have a diverse group of people with, very diverse I mean, our company Fahrenheit is a diverse group of people, different age groups, different backgrounds, different languages, different everything. And that pretty much ensures that we're getting very different insights, right? And ultimately, the most powerful insights are the ones that get everybody aligned, all the diverse people all together aligned on the fact that this person uncovered something that none of us had seen before. And, ultimately it is about uncovering what we haven't seen before. So to me, that's kind of, that's where you get alignment and a lot of head nodding, is when everybody begins to feel like, wow, you know what? I hadn't seen this before. And therefore your perspective and your point of view on this insight is quite critical, quite crucial.
Cool, thank you.
Sure. Okay, I guess no more questions. Anything else? Anyone? Last chance?
Rony, Manuela here.
Manuela, our Brazilian goddess.
Oh. I think insight is something that we can be trained at, and I'd love to see your views here, because I think we can either choose to sort of leave the situation without really stepping back and reflecting about it, or we can force ourselves to do that and become the observers of a particular thing or our lives or anything else, right? So for me, I don't know if I'm being naive, but I think as humans, we can force ourselves to step back and to sort of remove the emotions or our personal implications on and just ask ourselves, if I were from Mars, what would this mean? Like, what would be my possible interpretations of this situation? So I don't know. I do think that we can train to have insights by just training to remove ourselves from our sort of default point of view, and from that situation, so that position of observer, play with different possibilities. Don't you think?
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, I think, I mean, listen, I think first of all, I wouldn't want anyone to not be, I mean, to me, what makes you interesting is your point of view, right? If I wanted Marcus's point of view, I would call Marcus. So I wouldn't want you to give me Marcus's point of view because this is going to be very different. So to me, but yes, the fact that you can actually role play, and the fact that you can say, today I am, I'm born in Brazil and I'm a Brazilian, and here's my insight and point of view on this. As opposed to a British person, as opposed to a French person, I think you can role play that. But I mean, ultimately, I think the power is about you. I don't think you could ever really get to a true human truth by being. I don't think you can actually pretend to be French or pretend to be. Do you know what I mean? Like, to take yourself out of it to that degree. I think you can probably have a perspective on it. But is it going to be a really strong insight? I don't think so. I could never come up with an insight about anything in Brazil, no matter how much I read about Brazil, and no matter how much I know about Brazil and Brazilians, like you would. There's just, it's very difficult to do that, which is okay.
But I think for me, it's about not even doing. I think because we're all humans, and human behavior will boil down to something very fundamental. So it's ability to say, okay, I'm thinking about that because I'm Brazilian. However, I'm going to play with other ways, So it's more in that sense. But I agree with you. It's hard, but I think it's an exercise.
Well, and listen, and when you say play with it, at the same time, it's walking in another man's shoes. That's the whole premise of that is, it's about, and ultimately it's about when we understand each other. It's our ability to for me to know what it's what it means to be a Brazilian or a French or like whatever. Like, to me, it's all part of the game, right? But ultimately, I love to know what your insight and your perspective is on something because of who you are, right? I mean, that's the beauty of it.
Yeah, I guess it's impossible to dissociate from the observant, isn't it? Oh, it's yeah.
Yeah. Xavier.
Hello. So it strikes me that another masterclass that you can host quite well is one around empathy. And so I wondered how you would structure that and what would be the key nuggets.
How would you structure a conversation around empathy?
Yeah, a masterclass on empathy. So, when you're pitching the clients, you're very good at thinking about, okay, what's the client thinking? When you're thinking about launching a product, you're thinking, what are the pain points that individual customer is thinking? So,
yeah. This reminds me of a conversation I had way back, a long time ago, with JetBlue in the US. And we had done a project with a research project with JetBlue, and found out that their customers loved them because they were nice. And that's what overwhelmingly came back was they're nice. So I remember the chief marketing officer saying, literally asking me, so what's the strategy for nice? Which I've never forgotten, because I just thought it was such a good question of like, what is the strategy for nice? And you're like, and it was quite interesting because we had to take nice and figure out how to take something that is such an everyday common word and turn it into an actual strategy and turn it into a playbook so that they knew how to really be, to actually make nice a thing in the company versus a naturally occurring thing. But I mean, listen, I mean, ultimately empathy, there's words like empathy, vulnerability. These are great words for us, right? When you're empathetic, your ability to understand others, your ability to feel for others is quite critical. When you're vulnerable, your ability to step back and actually show who you are and show your true self. Again, these are all incredible words that I don't think, quite honestly, are industry words, and they're not really words that are readily used by the marketing communications world, because that's just, they're too soft, and soft words scare people because they don't know how to structure them. And it's like, what do I do with the word? What does it mean to be empathetic? Like, what is the strategy for empathy? And but I think that's worthy of a conversation. I mean, it's kind of a, listen, I mean, Brene Brown does a beautiful talk on vulnerability that gets you to see the world, yourself and the world very differently. And ultimately these are all different tools for all of us to better understand the world we're in today. And what I find interesting is, I ask myself the question, 50 years ago, were people thinking in the same way, right? During the 60s riots in the US, were people sitting around thinking about needing to understand each other better? Was that conversation happening back then? Or was it very, very, very polarized, political situation? I mean, and I think it was happening. I just think that we have more words today, deeper understanding, and probably are much more comfortable with having emotional conversations than would happen in the 60s. So I think the same conversations were happening, but we have different words and different tools today for expression and feeling and expression. Okay, any other questions? Okay, everyone, thank you all for joining us today. It was a total pleasure. Totally enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ronny.
Ronny.
Thank you, Ronny. Thank you, Ronny.
Thanks, Ronny.
Thanks, Ronny.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Ronny. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Great day.
Bye.